So we're doing a lecture recap for lecture 5 where we looked at brands and corporate culture. So in today's session we looked at corporate culture, so we started to explore what corporate culture is, break down its different component parts. That allows us to then analyse what's going on inside of an organisation and how that potentially impacts on the outside. So that's essentially what today's lecture is all about, because we're thinking about not just being able to manage audiences outside of the organisation, but managing them inside. And you might wonder, why is that important? Well, particularly in service organisations where your customers are likely to meet somebody who works for you, that obviously kind of has a more obvious importance. But equally, academics would argue that if you can't successfully manage communications with the staff within your organisation, what's the likelihood of you being able to do that with your customers? So if you can't get a message across clearly to people within your organisation, how are you going to get it across outside of the organisation? We looked at Google as an example because Google have a great reputation for employees. They are still number one place that people want to work according to Forbes. So number one best employer. And this is often about much of the internal benefits and sort of schemes that they offer the people that work for them. And you might ask, why is that important? Why are they investing in that? Because obviously it's not for free. There's a cost attached to it. So why might they concern themselves with treating their employees really well? And clearly, as a successful brand, they see many benefits to looking after this really key group of stakeholders. And essentially, what we're going to do today is break that down and explore it in a little bit more detail. So Van Riel and Von Broom are some of the seminal writers on corporate reputation. Talk about corporate identity as being made up of these 4 different elements. So thinking about who we are, so who are we as an organisation, and making that really clear and being really clear about what that actually means. What do we stand for? So what is important to us? What kind of core values do we have? What's our mission and vision? What's our core purpose? So what's our reason for being? What we're trying to achieve? And then as an employee or as a stakeholder, what does it mean to be involved in our company? So if you are part of our organisation, what does that actually mean, and what does it mean to us, but equally, what does it mean to you? Let's just think about corporate culture, because corporate culture essentially affects the way an organisation behaves and the actions it takes, the things it becomes involved in. So let's try and understand that a little bit more. Now, Dealing Kennedy really simplify corporate culture with this really nice short quote, the way we do things around here. So think about some of the organisations that you might have been involved in or you may have worked for already, even in a part-time job. There'll be kind of really specific ways of doing things in those organisations that sometimes aren't formalised, so they're not always written down. They might be kind of really informal ways of working, but they will govern the way that employees behave and how employees are treated. So there will be kind of informal norms and rules set that will really impact on both the experience of employees, but also the experience of anybody outside. And then equally, Shine breaks down culture into these 3 component parts. So it talks about espoused values, so those values that we have that we tell people about, our core values. Assumptions that we might make around the way we do things where there aren't kind of really clear rules, but there might be informal ways of working. And then artifacts and behaviours. So artifacts being anything kind of tangible that culturally we associate with the organisation. So it could be the building that the headquarters is in. It could be the brand. It could be the website. It could be celebrity. So it's kind of all the things that assemble around the brand. So some more recent papers, more recent pieces of research, and consider this a little bit more deeply as brand assemblage. So the kind of things you assemble around your brand that evoke the brand. And then the way that we behave as an organisation. So, you know, the things that we do, the actions we take, how we treat people, how we treat customers, what's our kind of narrative, what's our story, what's our kind of theme that's going on within our organisation, what do we say about how we treat customers, what do we say about the way we run our business, what's our response in certain situations. So all of those are all part of the corporate culture of an organisation and will affect ultimately the way that organisation is run, and you know, sort of whether purposefully or not, it will impact on the way that your staff behave and ultimately the way that they treat customers. As we can see on this slide, it kind of shows a little bit of what we looked at on the last slide. So they're kind of really obvious things that we can observe outside the organisation, such as symbols, stories, the behaviour, which is a lot of what I've just been saying. But underpinning that is a much deeper part of the iceberg. So it's all those kind of underlying beliefs and values, attitudes and feelings, because they really, really influence the observable elements. And if we look at a brand like Marks and Spencer, there might be kind of really observable parts to that brand, but equally be a lot of stuff that goes on behind closed doors that we can't or we don't see as external customers or stakeholders. Now, organisations can have strong or weak cultures, and strong cultures are where that the way we do things is really powerful and obvious, and everybody buys in, and it's a really strong culture. And a weaker culture might be where there's not quite you know, a really tangible way that you do things within that organisation. Now, while strong cultures can be really powerful if they're positive things and they represent what the organisation wants in terms of its corporate identity, they can be difficult to change because of their strong nature. So, you know, if you've always done things a certain way as an organisation and you try to change that to evolve with customer needs or whatever it might be, that can then become problematic because the way you've done things is so inherently embedded in everybody's attitudes and behaviour. So there are clearly benefits to having a strong culture, but it can mean you become less agile as an organisation, which can be troublesome if you're in a dynamic marketplace. Just to give you some examples of kind of visible symbols of artifacts of internal culture, you can see the two different headquarters buildings of two brands here. So here's Tesco's, that looks a bit drab and dull and boring, and obviously the Google one really kind of tries to represent what their brand stands for. So it looks very modern, contemporary, forward thinking and dynamic. So it's quite interesting just to look at those two buildings in isolation and think about, you know, do they represent how that organisation sees itself in terms of its corporate identity as well as its of its internal culture. When we look at organisations in terms of what goes on within inside them, there's kind of these two aspects that Goffey and Jones advocate as looking at. So that's the kind of social ability. So how social is the organisation versus the solidarity. So how kind of tied together are we in the sense that we pull together in times of crisis. And you can see that probably the places that you want to be is like this communal, where everybody's working together, highly sociable organisation. Employees tend to spend time with one another outside of work. And we're working together. We're not kind of, you know, we're not searching for buy-in. And if we want to change things within a communal organisation, it's relatively easy to get people on board and for them to feel part of that change. Whereas if you're in a fragmented or a mercenary organisation, that can be much more difficult, and you're much more likely to come up against resistance, which can be problematic if you're trying to implement change quickly, if you work in a dynamic industry. So it's worth thinking about. Think about some of the organisations you've worked for. What, you know, what was their nature in terms of how kind of sociable and how much solidarity there was in that workplace. So Roper and Phil make this really important argument around the importance of values and culture in terms of, you know, recruiting the best staff and retaining those staff, and then having a really strong brand. If you think about particularly in service organisations, this is important because you know, your staff are going to meet people from the kind of customer group, and it's important that that's a really positive interaction because it can have a huge impact on the on the customer's experience ultimately. So, you know, we want those employees working in a really customer focused sense. And likewise, sort of building on this idea that what the staff do and how they interact with customers is really kind of important in terms of brand experience. Gromruse and Lindberg developed this brand communications triangle, and essentially what they're saying is the all of those different touch points and interactions that customers have with staff or employees from an organisation are kind of the most important in terms of what's believable and impact on their experience. Second to that is endorsements, so both kind of celebrity endorsements, equally the endorsements of word of mouth from other people who they might know, friends and family. And then thirdly, the third kind of type of communications is what the firm says about themselves, so through advertising, sponsorship, whatever it might be. And of course, that's deemed to be kind of the least credible in terms of impact on brand experience and also image and identity. So in terms of what the customer takes away and the perceptions that they then form. If we go to RepTrak, which we looked at a couple of lectures ago when we were considering reputation, and we look at some of the measurement dimensions, you can see here the ones that I've circled are all elements of parts of the business that things that go on within the organisation. So not necessarily just about the kind of performance of the brand, but how well the brand's led, what the workplace is like, and how innovative they are. And that all comes down to what goes on within the organisation. So again, you know, it's considering that this stuff what goes on inside the organisation really does have quite a fundamental impact on both the brand and perceptions and experience and brand image and identity, reputation as well, and that kind of corporate identity of the organisation. So it's just kind of really trying to recognise the interface between the two and how we might map that, which is something that we'll be doing in the seminar. Okay, and just sort of developing that point a little bit further, is this idea that how satisfied your employees are will have a huge impact on the brand reputation. So if we're talking about the point that I was just making around corporate culture, equally having happy employees is really vital to ensure kind of really effective delivery of those brand values. Remember that this is where we start to think about the interface between human resources and marketing, because ultimately those the employee satisfaction will in part come down to their terms and conditions, any benefits they receive, the recognition that they get. And this is particularly important to service brands where there are those interactions between people who work for the brand and customers. But ultimately, you know, if you are a happy employee, what this is saying is essentially that, you know, you don't need to worry so much about the customers, because having happy employees will take care of the customers and ensure that they have positive experiences and interactions with brands. So we are moving more towards being a service environment. But this diagram just shows you the kind of difference between pure services, where there's really very little physical content whatsoever, and kind of high physical content, really tangible products like things like toothpaste, where you're unlikely to have any interactions with somebody from the organisation, versus, you know, getting a degree, having your hair cut, going to a solicitor's, which are all kind of quite there's nothing tangible for you to evaluate, which leads you to evaluate perhaps not services in not the same way that you'd evaluate a product. I mean, products, when we're evaluating them, we're generally looking at their performance in terms of our expectations. But if you think about going to a solicitor's and how you might evaluate your experience there, it's kind of less likely to be about the technical aspects of the legal services, because you're unlikely to have the capability to be able to evaluate those accurately, and more likely to be around those kind of touch point interactions that you have with people who work for the organisation. we go back to those touch point interactions in just a second, but really what we want to achieve are brand champions. So we really want to have people working for us who are very much on brand in terms of our core values and actually championing that brand. So they're not just sort of compliant and sort of disciplined employees, but they are real advocates of the brand, and they really do want to do a fantastic job and also tell other people outside of the organisation positive stories around the brand, because that will really then facilitate that kind of aura, that assemblage that sits around the brand. Around touch points, Jan Carlson of Scandinavian Airways Services came up with this idea of moments of truth, and his argument was that every single interaction between an employee and a customer is a moment of truth. It's an opportunity, essentially, for those moments of truth to be moments of magic, and that's really what we're seeking for, because that's what develops loyal customers. Remember that brand loyalty is the thing that sits right at the very top of the customer-based brand equity pyramid. So if that's what we're building towards, these moments of truth are really, really important to forge those relationships and get customers keep returning to us. So each moment of truth is the potential to be a moment of misery where things go really very wrong, moment of mediocrity, which is probably what most of our service touch points are. So they're not wonderful, but they're not dreadful. So they kind of keep us satisfied, but we're not absolutely delighted. And then those moments of magic. So those moments you have where your expectations are really exceeded as a customer, and the interaction that you have with the employees very fruitful. So essentially, we need to get our just like the last slide, we need to get employees on brand and become brand champions if we really want every moment of truth to be a moment of magic, which is ultimately what we're aiming. So how do we achieve that? How do we get customers on board? We really need to have employees that fit very well with our brand, but also believe in what we stand for and understand, have that knowledge and understanding of who we are as an organisation. So recruiting the right staff is important, but equally training and clear internal communications to ensure that staff understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. And we can look at some of the elements. So according to Londorf and the other chap, what they're saying is we can build our brand inside of the organisation in exactly the same way that you might do outside of the organisation. But obviously our target audience now is employees rather than customers. And they come up with these 5 different elements to achieve this. So being really clear about what our core values are and communicating them to the people that work for us, recruiting the right people in the first place who really share our values, making sure that employees understand the brand meaning. So what is our identity? What are we aiming for? And equally, what is the image? Having a kind of really powerful and sustainable internal communications program, and then where we do have brand champions already, using them as role models, so getting them to get the message out there too as kind of opinion leaders, and using them as examples of how we want people to behave who work in our organisation and really what we're driving towards. However, arguably, there are limitations to internal brand building. We need to be really careful. So we need to make sure that just in the same way as we would with external communications, that the messages are really clear, so there's no misunderstanding around what it is that we stand for. We don't want our employees to feel completely brainwashed so that they can't use their initiative or make decisions for themselves. We kind of want them to be in line with the brand without having to make them feel that everything is contrived and very rehearsed, and that they don't have any kind of freedom to sort of influence the way that they behave themselves. So we have to really carefully evaluate where and when we should use internal branding. So just like external communications, when is it appropriate and when isn't it? When is it unnecessary? And actually what we're doing is making our employees feel that it's all very, very controlled. Just to finish up, we need to be aware of our corporate culture, and actually if there's stuff going on in our service, if we're a service-based organisation and there are facets of our service that we're unhappy with, that we think we need to look at, perhaps using internal culture as a map can help us work out what's going well and what's going not so well. Just like, if you're looking at innovation, if it was being stifled within your organisation, you might start to look at what aspects of the culture are being barriers and what are enablers towards innovation implementation. It's particularly relevant to service brands because, as we said before, there are all those really important moments of truth, those touch points between the customer and the employee that we need to be aware of. And fundamentally, those interactions will have an impact on how customers evaluate the brand. So even if they have the most fantastic technical service, if you're a solicitor, or you offer some kind of complex service, then if your customer service element is not central to that, that can still be problematic. So you might be doing a great job technically, but remember, how will the customer evaluate their brand experience? What can they evaluate? So there's kind of clear links between brand and reputation and corporate culture. We need to be aware of them. And as we'll do in the seminar, we can map out internal culture and work out how is it influencing what goes on within our organisation. Potentially, how is it influencing our touch point experiences for the customers? Equally, it can be managed through internal branding. So we need to carefully think about when is it appropriate to run and implement a internal communications campaign, and when do we need to be sort of mindful of some of those limitations that we looked at on the last slide.